Chapter 9 of Agriculture for Beginners. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Agriculture for Beginners by Charles William Burkett. Chapter 9. Feedstuffs. Section 51. Grasses. Under usual conditions, no farmer expects to grow livestock successfully and economically without setting apart a large part of his land for the growth of mowing and pasture crops. Therefore, to the grower of stock, the management of grass crops is all important. In planting, either for a meadow or for a pasture, the farmer should mix different varieties of grass seeds. Nature mixes them when she plants, and nature is always a trustworthy teacher. In planting for a pasture, the aim should be to sow such seeds as will give green grass from early spring to latest fall. In seeding for a meadow, such varieties should be sowed together as ripen about the same time. Even in those sections of the country where it grows sparingly and where it is easily crowded out, clover should be mixed with all grasses sowed, for it leaves in the soil a wealth of plant food for the grasses coming after it to feed on. Nearly every part of our country has some clover that experience shows to be exactly suited to its soil and climate. Study these clovers carefully and mix them with your grass seed. The reason for mixing clover and grass is at once seen. The true grasses, as far as science now shows, get all their nitrogen from the soil. Hence they more or less exhaust the soil. But as several times explained in this book, the clovers are legumes, and all legumes are able, by means of the bacteria that live on their roots, to use the free nitrogen of the air. Hence, without cost to the farmer, these clovers help the soil to feed their neighbors, the true grasses. For this reason, some light perennial legume should always be added to grass seed. It is not possible for grasses to do well in a soil that is full of weeds. For this reason, it is always best to sow grass in fields from which cultivated crops have just been taken. Soil which is to have grass sowed in it should have its particles pressed together. The small grass seeds cannot take root and grow well in land that has just been plowed and which consequently has its particles loose and comparatively far apart. On the other hand, land from which a crop of corn or cotton has just been harvested is in a compact condition. The soil particles are pressed well together. Such land, when mellowed by harrowing, makes a splendid bed for grass seeds. A firm soil draws moisture up to the seeds, while a mellow soil acts as a blanket to keep moisture from wasting into the air, and at the same time allows the heated air to circulate in the soil. In case land has to be plowed for grass seeding, the plowing should be done as far as possible in advance of the seeding. Then the plowed land should be harrowed several times to get the land in a soft, mellow condition. If the seed bed be carefully prepared, little work on the ground is necessary after the seeds are sowed. One light harrowing is sufficient to cover the broadcast seeds. This harrowing should always be done as soon as the seeds are scattered, for if there be moisture in the soil, the tiny seeds will soon sprout, and if harrowing be done after germination is somewhat advanced, the tender grass plants will be injured. There are many kinds of pasture and meadow grasses. In New England, timothy, red clover, and red top are generally used for the mowing crop. For permanent pasture, in addition to those mentioned, there should be added white clover and either Kentucky or Canadian blue grass. In the southern states, a good meadow or pasture can be made of orchard grass, red clover, and red top. For a permanent pasture in the south, Japan clover, Bermuda, and such other local grasses as have been found to adapt themselves readily to the climate should be added. In the middle states, temporary meadows and pastures are generally made of timothy and red clover, while for permanent pastures, white clover and blue grass thrive well. In the more western states, the grasses previously suggested are readily at home. Alfalfa is proving its adaptability to nearly all sections and climates, and is in many respects the most promising grass crop of America. It hardly ever pays to pasture meadows except slightly the first season, and then only when the soil is dry. It is also poor policy to pasture any kind of grassland early in the spring when the soil is wet, because the tramping of animals crushes and destroys the crowns of the plants. After the first year, the sward becomes thicker and tougher, and the grass is not at all injured if it is grazed wisely. The state of maturity at which grass should be harvested to make hay of the best quality varies somewhat with the different grasses and with the use which is to be made of the hay. Generally speaking, it is a good rule to cut grass for hay just as it is beginning to bloom or just after the bloom has fallen. All grasses become less palatable to stock as they mature and form seed. If grass be allowed to go to seed, most of the nutrition in the stalk is used to form the seed. Hence a good deal of food is lost by waiting to cut hay until the seeds are formed. Pasture lands and meadow lands are often greatly improved by replowing and harrowing in order to break up the turf that forms and to admit air more freely into the soil. The plant roots that are destroyed by the plowing or harrowing make quickly available plant food by their decay, and the physical improvement of the soil leads to a thicker and better stand. In the older sections of the country, commercial fertilizer can be used to advantage in producing hay and pasturage. If, however, clover has just been grown on grassland, or if it is growing well with the grass, there is no need to add nitrogen. If the grass seems to lack sufficient nourishment, add phosphoric acid and potash. However, grass not grown in company with clover often needs dried blood, nitrate of soda, or some other nitrogen-supplying agent. Of course, it is understood that no better fertilizer can be applied to grass than barnyard manure. Section 52. Legumes. Often land which was once thought excellent is left to grow up in weeds. The owner says that the land is worn out and that it will not pay to plant it. What does worn out mean? Simply that constant cropping has used up the plant food in the land. Therefore, plants on worn-out land are too nearly starved to yield bountifully. Such wearing out is so easily prevented that no owner ought ever to allow his land to become poverty-stricken. But in case this misfortune has happened, how can the land be again made fertile? On page 24, you learn that phosphoric acid, potash, and nitrogen are the foods most needed by plants. Worn out, then, to put in another way, usually means that a soil has been robbed of one of these plant necessities, or of two or of all three. To make the land once more fruitful, it is necessary to restore the missing food or foods. How can this be done? Two of these plant foods, namely phosphoric acid and potash, are minerals. If either of these is lacking, it can be supplied only by putting on the land some fertilizer containing the missing food. Fortunately, however, nitrogen, the most costly of the plant foods, can be readily and cheaply returned to poor land. As explained on page 32, the leguminous crops have the power of drawing nitrogen from the air, and by means of their root tubercles, of storing it in the soil. Hence, by growing these crops on poor land, the expense of nitrogen is quickly restored to the soil, and only the two cheaper plant foods need be bought. How important is it then to grow these leguminous plants? Every farmer should so rotate his planting that at least once every 2 or 3 years a crop of legumes may add to the fruitfulness of his fields. Moreover, these crops help land in another way. They send a multitude of roots deep into the ground. These roots loosen and pulverize the soil, and their decay at the end of the growing season leaves much humus in the soil. Land will rarely become worn out if legumes are regularly and wisely grown. From the fact that they do well in so many different sections and in so many different climates, the following are the most useful legumes: alfalfa, clovers, cowpeas, vetches, and soybeans. Alfalfa. Alfalfa is primarily a hay crop. It thrives in the far west, in the middle west, in the north, and in the south. In fact, it will do well wherever the soil is rich, moist, deep, and underlaid by an open subsoil. The vast areas given to this valuable crop are yearly increasing in every section of the United States. Alfalfa, however, unlike the cowpea, does not take to poor land. For its cultivation, therefore, good fertile land that is moist but not water-soaked should be selected. Good farmers are partial to alfalfa for 3 reasons. First, it yields a heavy crop of forage or hay. Second, being a legume, it improves the soil. Third, one seeding lasts a long time. This length of life may, however, be destroyed by pasturing or abusing the alfalfa. Alfalfa is different from most plants in this respect. The soil in which it grows must have certain kinds of bacteria in it. These cause the growth of tubercles on the roots. These bacteria, however, are not always present in land that has not been planted in alfalfa. Hence, if this plant is to be grown successfully, these helpful bacteria must sometimes be supplied artificially. There are 2 very easy ways of supplying the germs. First, fine soil from an alfalfa field may be scattered broadcast over the fields to be seeded. Second, a small mass of alfalfa tubercle germs may be put into a liquid containing proper food to make these germs multiply and grow. Then the seeds to be planted are soaked in this liquid in order that the germs may fasten on the seeds. Before the seeds are sowed, the soil should be mellowed. Over this well-prepared land, about 20 pounds of seed to the acre should be scattered. The seed may be scattered by hand or by a seed sower. Cover with a light harrow. The time of planting varies somewhat with the climate. Except where the winters are too severe, the seed may be sowed either in the spring or in the fall. In the South, sow only in the fall. During the first season, 1 mowing, perhaps more, is necessary to ensure a good stand and also to keep down the weeds. When the first blossoms appear in the early summer, it is time to start the mower. After this, the alfalfa should be cut every 2, 3, or 4 weeks. The number of times depends on the rapidity of growth. This crop rarely makes a good yield the first year, but if a good stand be secured, the yield steadily increases. After a good stand has been secured, a top dressing of either commercial fertilizer or stable manure will be very helpful. An occasional cutting up of the sod with a disc harrow does much good. Clovers. The different kinds of clovers will sometimes grow on hard or poor soil, but they do far better if the soil is enriched and properly prepared before the seed is sowed. In many parts of our country, it has been the practice for generations to sow clover seed with some of the grain crops. Barley, wheat, oats, and rye are the crops with which clover is usually planted, but many good farmers now prefer to sow the seed only with other grass seed. Circumstances must largely determine the manner of seeding. Crimson clover, which is a winter legume, usually does best when seeded alone, although rye or some other grain often seems helpful to it. This kind of clover is an excellent crop with which to follow cotton or corn. It is most conveniently sowed at the last cultivation of these crops. Common red clover, which is the standard clover over most of the country, is usually seeded with timothy or with orchard grass, or with some other of the grasses. In sowing both crimson and red clover, about 10 to 15 pounds of seed for each acre are generally used. To make good pastures, white and Japan clover are favorites. White clover does well in most parts of America, and Japan clover is especially valuable in warm southern climates. Both do well even when the soil is partly shaded, but they do best in land fully open to the sun. Careful attention is required to cure clover hay well. The clover should always be cut before it forms seed. The best time to cut is when the plants are in full bloom. Let the mower be started in the morning, then a few hours later run over the field with the tender. This will loosen the hay and let in air and sunshine. If the weather be fair, let the hay lie until the next day, and then rake it into rows for further drying. After being raked, the hay may either be left in the rows for final curing, or it may be put in cocks. If the weather be unsettled, it is best to cock the hay. Many farmers have cloth covers to protect the cocks, and these often aid greatly in saving the hay crop in a rainy season. In case the hay is put in cocks, it should be opened for a final drying before it is housed. Cowpeas. The cowpea is an excellent soil enricher. It supplies more fertilizing material to turn into the soil in a short time and at small cost than any other crop. Moreover, by good tillage and by the use of a very small amount of fertilizer, The cowpea can be grown on land too poor to produce any other crop. Its roots go deep into the soil. Hence they gather plant food and moisture that shallow-rooted plants fail to reach. These quantities make it an invaluable help in bringing worn-out lands back to fertility. The cowpea is a warm-weather legume. In the United States, it succeeds best in the South and Southwest. It has, however, in recent years, been grown as far north as Massachusetts, New York, Ohio, Michigan, and Minnesota, but in these warm climates, other legumes are more useful. Cowpeas should never be planted until all danger of frost is past. Some varieties make their full growth in 2 months, others need 4 months. There are about 200 varieties of cowpeas. These varieties differ in form, in the size of seed and of pod, in the color of seed and of pod, and in the time of ripening. They differ too in the manner of growth. Some grow erect, others sprawl on the ground. In selecting varieties, it is well to choose those that grow straight up, those that are hardy, those that fruit early and abundantly, and those that hold their leaves. The variety selected for seed should also suit the land and the climate. The cowpea will grow in almost any soil. It thrives best and yields most bountifully in well-drained, sandy loams. The plant also does well on clay soils. On light sandy soils, a fairly good crop may be made, but on such soils, wilt and root knot are dangerous foes. A warm, moist, well-pulverized seed bed should always be provided. Few plants equal the cowpea in repaying careful preparation. If this crop is grown for hay, the method of seeding and cultivating will differ somewhat from the method used when a seed crop is desired. When cowpeas are planted for hay, the seeds should be drilled or broadcasted. If the seeds are small and the land somewhat rich, about 4 pecks should be sowed on each acre. If the seeds are comparatively large and the soil not so fertile, about 6 pecks should be sowed to the acre. It is safer to disc in the seeds when they are sowed broadcast than it is to rely on a harrow to cover them. In sowing merely for a hay crop, it is a good practice to mix sorghum, corn, soybeans, or millet with the cowpeas. The mixed hay is more easily harvested and more easily cured than unmixed cowpea hay. Shortly after seeding, it pays to run over the land lightly with a harrow or a weeder in order to break any crust that may form. Mowing should begin as soon as the stalks and the pods have finished growing and some of the lower leaves have begun to turn yellow. An ordinary mower is perhaps the best machine for cutting the vines. If possible, select only a bright day for mowing and do not start the machine until the dew on the vines is dried. Allow the vines to remain as they fell from the mower till they are wilted, then rake them into windrows. The vines should generally stay in the windrows for 2 or 3 days and be turned on the last day. They should then be put in small, airy piles or piled around a stake that has cross pieces nailed to it. The drying vines should never be packed. Air must circulate freely if good hay is to be made. As piling the vines around stakes is somewhat laborious, some growers watch the curing carefully and succeed in getting the vines dry enough to haul directly from the windrows to the barns. Never allow the vines to stay exposed to too much sunshine when they are first cut. If the sun strikes them too strongly, the leaves will become brittle and shatter when they are moved. When cowpeas are grown for their pods to ripen, the seeds should be planted in rows about a yard apart. From 2 or 3 pecks of seeds to an acre should be sufficient. The growing plants should be cultivated 2 or 3 times with a good cultivator. Cowpeas were formerly gathered by hand, but such a method is of course slow and expensive. Pickers are now commonly used. Some farmers use the cowpea crop only as a soil enricher. Hence they neither gather the seeds nor cut the hay, but plow the whole crop into the soil. There is an average of about 47 pounds of nitrogen in each ton of cowpea vines. Most of this valuable nitrogen is drawn by the plants from the air. This amount of nitrogen is equal to that contained in 9,500 pounds of stable manure. In addition, each ton of cowpea vines contains 10 pounds of phosphoric acid and 29 pounds of potash. There is danger in plowing into the soil at one time any bountiful green crop like cowpeas. As already explained on page 10, A process called capillarity enables moisture to rise in the soil as plants need it. Now, if a heavy cowpea crop or any other similar crop be at one plowing turned into the soil particles will be so separated as to destroy capillarity. Too much vegetation turned under at once may also, if the weather be warm, cause fermentation to set in and sour the land. Both of these troubles may be avoided by cutting the vines with a disc harrow or other implement before covering them. The custom of planting cowpeas between the rows at the last working of corn is a good one, and wherever the climate permits, this custom should be followed. Vetches. The vetches have been rapidly growing in favor for some years. Stock eat vetch hay greedily, and this hay increases the flow of milk in dairy animals and helps keep animals fat and sleek. Only two species of vetch are widely grown. These are the tare or spring vetch and the winter or hairy vetch. Spring vetch is grown in comparatively few sections of our country. It is, however, grown widely in England and northern continental Europe. What we say here will be confined to hairy vetch. After a soil has been supplied with the germs needed by this plant, the hairy vetch is productive on many different kinds of soil. The plant is most vigorous on fertile loams. By good tillage and proper fertilization, it may be forced to grow rather bountifully on poor sandy and clay loams. Acid or wet soils are not suited to vetch. Lands that are too poor to produce clovers will frequently yield fair crops of vetch. If this is borne in mind, many poor soils may be wonderfully improved by growing on them this valuable legume. Vetch needs a fine, well-compacted seed bed, but it is often sowed with good results on stubble lands and between cotton and corn rows, where it is covered by a cultivator or a weeder. The seeds of the vetch are costly and are brought chiefly from Germany, where this crop is much prized. The pods ripen so irregularly that they have to be picked by hand. In northern climates, early spring sowing is found most satisfactory. In southern climates, the seeding is best done in the late summer or early fall. As the vetch vines have a tendency to trail on the ground, it is wisest to plant with the vetch some crop like oats, barley, rye, or wheat. These plants will support the vetch and keep its vines from being injured by falling on the ground. Do not use rye with vetch in the south. It ripens too early to be of much assistance. If sowed with oats, the seeding should be at the rate of about 20 or 30 pounds of vetch and about 1½ or 2 bushels of oats to the acre. Vetch is covered in the same way as wheat and rye. Few crops enrich soil more rapidly than vetch if the whole plant is turned in. It, of course, adds nitrogen to the soil and at the same time supplies the soil with a large amount of organic matter to decay and change to humus. As the crop grows during the winter, it makes an excellent cover to prevent washing. Many orchard growers of the Northwest find vetch the best winter crop for the orchards as well as for the fields. Soy or soya bean. In China and Japan, the soybean is grown largely as food for man. In the United States, it is used as a forage plant and as a soil improver. It bids fair to become one of the most popular of the legumes. Like the cowpea, this bean is at home only in a warm climate. Some of the early ripening varieties have, however, been planted with fair success in cold climates. While there are a large number of varieties of the soybean, only about a dozen are commonly grown. They differ mainly in the color, size, and shape of the seeds, and in the time needed for ripening. Some of the varieties are more hairy than others. Soybeans may take many places in good crop rotations, but they are unusually valuable in short rotations with small grains. The grains can be cut in time for the beans to follow them, and in turn, the beans can be harvested in the early fall and make way for another grain crop. It should always be remembered that soybeans will not thrive unless the land on which they are to grow is already supplied or is supplied at the time of sowing with bean bacteria. The plant will grow on many different kinds of soil, but it needs a richer soil than the cowpea does. As the crop can gather most of its own nitrogen, it generally requires only the addition of phosphoric acid and potash for its growth on poor land. When the first crop is seeded, apply to each acre 400 pounds of a fertilizing mixture which contains about 10% of phosphoric acid, 4% of potash, and from 1 to 2% of nitrogen. If the crop is planted for hay or for grazing, mellow the ground well, and then broadcast or drill in closely about 1½ bushels of seed to each acre. Cover from 1 to 2 inches deep, but never allow a crust to form over the seed, for the plant cannot break through a crust well. When the beans are planted for seeds, a ½ bushel of seed to the acre is usually sufficient. The plants should stand in rows from 4 to 6 inches apart, and the rows should be from 30 to 40 inches from one another. Never plant until the sun has thoroughly warmed the land. The bean may be sowed, however, earlier than cowpeas. A most convenient time is just after corn is planted. The rows should be cultivated often enough to keep out weeds and grass and to keep a good dust mulch, but the cultivation must be shallow. As soybeans are grown for hay and also for seed, the harvesting will, as with the other legumes, be controlled by the purpose for which the crop was planted. In harvesting for a hay crop, it is desirable to cut the beans after the pods are well formed, but before they are fully grown. If the cutting is delayed until the pods are ripe, the fruit will shatter badly. There is a loss, too, in the food value of the stems if the cutting is late. The ordinary mowing machine with a rake attached is generally the machine used for cutting the stalks. The leaves should be most carefully preserved, for they contain much nourishment for stock. Whenever the beans are grown for seeds, harvesting should begin when 3/4 of the leaves have fallen and most of the pods are ripe. Do not wait, however, until the pods are so dry that they have begun to split and drop their seeds. A slight amount of dampness on the plants aids the cutting. The threshing may be done with a flail, with pea hullers, or with a grain threshing machine. The beans produce more seed to the acre than cowpeas do. 40 bushels is a high yield. The average yield is between 20 and 30 bushels. Descriptive table. Crop: alfalfa. Adaptation as food for animals: hay. Life: perennial. Remarks: all animals like it. Hogs eat it even when it is dry. Crop: red clover. Adaptation as food for animals: hay and pasture. Life: perennial. Remarks: best of the clovers for hay. Crop: Alsike clover. Adaptation as food for animals: hay and pasture. Life: perennial. Remarks: seeds itself for 20 years. This clover is a great favorite with bees. Crop: mammoth clover. Adaptation as food for animals: hay and pasture. Life: perennial. Remarks: best for green manure. Crop: white clover. Adaptation as food for animals: pasture. Life: perennial. Remarks: excellent for lawns and bees. Crop: Japan clover. Adaptation as food for animals: pasture. Life: perennial. Remarks: excellent for forest and old soils. Crop: cowpea. Adaptation as food for animals: hay and grain. Life: annual. Remarks: used for hay, green manure, and pastures. Crop: soybean. Adaptation as food for animals: hay and grain. Life: annual. Remarks: often put in silo with corn. Crop: vetches. Adaptation as food for animals: hay and soiling. Life: annual. Remarks: pasture for sheep and swine. With cereals, it makes excellent hay and soiling food. End of chapter 9.